The person who understands this, frankly, as well or better than anybody in the United Kingdom is my next guest. Delighted to be joined by Patrick Minford, CBE Professor of Applied Economics at Cardiff Business School. Patrick, thanks for being with us. I really do appreciate your time here on Tice Talk. And I think you heard my Sunday sermon about this really important issue of the way that the Bank of England is charging interest and dealing with this internal debt between the bank and the government, this quantitative easing, and how much that's essentially forcing us taxpayers to be, I'm going to use the word, impoverished. What are your thoughts?
Yes, morning, Richard. I completely agree. You see, what has happened is that, in fact, the bank bought a lot of government debt during COVID and during the financial crisis aftermath, and it's now, and it printed money to pay for it, you know, and that money wound up in the banks as cash, which was then deposited by the banks in the Bank of England, and that is called bank reserves. And that amount of money that was used to buy all these government debt to kind of keep the markets calm during those periods and bring down interest rates has come to be an enormous amount of money. I mean, it's 950 billion pounds. And what the convention that's now being followed by the government and the bank is to pay interest on the money. That's the bank reserves. But this is absolute nonsense. It's money. It's not debt. And so they're paying interest at bank rate on 950 billion pounds, which comes to a huge amount of money. As interest rates go up to 4%, as they may well do soon, that will be about 40 billion pounds that has to be paid for by taxpayers. And this is absolute nonsense. You see, the banks are benefiting from the privilege of what's called lender of last resort. And as a result, they need to kind of be very grateful for this. And you know, they have the ability to go to the Bank of England at any time when there's a run on them and, you know, be bailed out, essentially, by the bank lending them money. And so, and these bank reserves would then be used, you see, to deal with that. But to be paid at these exorbitant interest rates for holding those, for having that cash in there at the Bank of England is completely ridiculous.
So what we've got here is a situation where, in a sense, the government's not consolidating these numbers, and therefore there's a huge black hole in the Treasury accounts. And so am I right? Essentially, that's the reason why, one of the reasons why the Chancellor felt that he had to raise taxes.
Yes, it's basically part of what he keeps on calling as the black hole, you know, the fiscal hole. But 40 billion of this comes from this nonsense, which is treating bank reserves as government debt, which they're not. They're simply, you know, cash held by the banks at the Bank of England, on which no interest is payable. And you see, what the central bank argues, what Bank of England argues, is that the banks could invest that money in treasury bills and interfere with the bank's efforts to fix bank rate by, you know, buying and selling treasury bills. But again, that's nonsense, because there are lots of ways of stopping that.
So Patrick, what I would do, and I've said this for a year now, all of the bank's quantitative easing, which I thought was 850 billion, you mentioned 950, all of that, in my view, should be made into a Corona-like war bond for 75 years with a fixed rate of interest of, let's say, 2.25%, a notional rate of interest, and just left on the Bank of England's computer, and that dramatically changes the numbers.
Well, you see, the trouble is, Richard, that the counterpart of that is the problem. It's the money that they printed, you see, and that's being treated by the bank as a debt, which it isn't. It's money.
Exactly.
You see, treating money as debt is a terrible mistake, because you don't pay interest on money. But what the bank is doing is kind of, through grace and favor to the banks, it's paying them interest. You see, instead of saying, don't you jolly well go and invest this money in treasury bills and interfere with our open market operations in fixing bank rate, they're saying, we'll pay you we'll pay you the bank rate so you don't have an incentive to go and buy treasury bills. I mean, it's ludicrous because it's a privilege.
So I use the analogy, and I'll relate this to Brexit, when we wanted to take back control of our money. But essentially with this process, the governor and the Bank of England and the people making this decision, they're essentially enriching institutions and people in the city at the expense of the taxpayer, totally unnecessarily. Is that right?
Exactly. You see, 40 billion is an absolutely huge amount of money to be paying to the banks for the privilege of their getting lender of last resort backing by the Bank of England. You see, I mean, it's nonsense to pay them this money. And it's all the result of some sort of arcane... You see, when interest rates were zero, it didn't matter because there wasn't anything involved.
Yes.
Or when, before all the financial crisis, the bank reserves were really small, so it was all peanuts, and nobody thought about it. But now it's far from peanuts. You know, when you've got on the Bank of England's balance sheet, you know, bank reserves of 950 billion, you know, as a result of all these accumulated operations, it's no longer peanuts. It's become a very serious issue, and the taxpayer is paying for a kind of ancient convention that you pay interest on bank reserves, you see, which you only do if they're trivially small.
Patrick, that's absolutely fascinating. Now, just before I ask you a question about some of who controls the rulemaking in the city, I just got a question here from a caller that I get your thoughts on. John is in Bradford. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
What's your? Have you got a question for me or for Patrick?
Well, it's a statement actually. What I can't understand is how this man, that was the head of the FCA, and lots and lots of people, including myself, lots of money on a peer-to-peer company called Lendy, that were warned about the problems with this company and did absolutely nothing about it, and people have lost their life savings. Is how a man like this can be put in the charge of the Bank of England is beyond me.
John, it's there were a number of problems at the FCA, not just that, but also Neil Woodford's fund that failed. Patrick, what is the process for the appointment of the governor of Bank of England? It always seems to be a sort of internal stitch-up, but maybe I'm being a bit harsh.
Well, it's you know, it comes from whoever's available, who has got the qualifications. And on this occasion, yes, he had been chair of the FCA, eventually, and that was one of the reasons why there was some reluctance to appoint him, actually, because, you know, some things had gone wrong on his watch. But the difficulty is finding people to do this job who've got the qualifications.
Yes.
And, you know, he's been in the bank for a very long time, so he's kind of worked his way up from the sort of shop, from the floor, really.
And I guess that brings me, actually, thank you very much, John, in Bradford, for that call, because that actually brings me on to the other point, which is that there's also talk now and again with Brexit, we want to take back control of our laws so that our democratically elected government could be responsible for those rules. But there's now a huge row going on with bigwigs in the city about who essentially is going to be responsible for some of the city regulation. Who's going to decide whether or not to change the rules that the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, or what they call the Prudential Regulation Authority. And it seems that the people in the city are basically resisting calls from the government that the government could have a say in changing those rules. And that doesn't seem to me like taking back control of our rules.
No, that's true. I mean, obviously, there's an argument to be had about what the rules should be, and it's perfectly legitimate for the city to put its views, you know. And obviously, the main object of all this is for the city to be competitive. So the city should have a voice on, you know, what the rules are, because we want the city to be a highly competitive international actor. And so there's a discussion to be had. I mean, really, it's a tussle between being very, very cautious and kind of protecting the reputation for stability of the city against being competitive and able to do more things in the international arena, like investing in infrastructure and so forth. So it's a discussion that's got to be had. I don't think it's black and white.
Absolutely. I think it's really important, ultimately, that the government has the final say. Of course, the city can put their point of view, but
Exactly.
in order to get a really competitive, we don't want it to be burdened with outdated EU regulation, things like MiFID and stuff. I want a lean, mean set of rules that makes us competitive with the rest of the world, not just with Frankfurt and Paris. Just before you go, Patrick, I've just got another caller here from Basingstoke. Simon is on the line. Hi, Simon. Have you got a question for me or Patrick?
I've got a question for both of you. I mean, I wonder if Patrick is aware that the Treasury made a payment to the Bank of England to pay for the losses it had incurred on its QE gilts of £11 billion last week. And the fact is that when the Bank of England first started QE, it made an agreement with the government that any losses the Bank of England would suffer from it would be paid for directly by the Treasury. And my second question is this. Why even have a perpetual bond for that debt? Why not just say to the Bank of England that debt is no longer applies, that was an emergency situation, that debt should now be retired, and then we automatically reduce the level of national debt by £850 billion.
Simon, two great questions. Patrick, what are your thoughts on that? Firstly, the payment, the QE payment.
Well, there's a bit of confusion about this QE payment. You see, as it's inside the public sector, it doesn't actually impinge on the taxpayer. It's one public sector body, the Bank of England, which is wholly owned by the Treasury, being passed money from the Treasury, which wholly owns it. So it's a completely meaningless transaction, really. It doesn't impinge on the taxpayer because it doesn't add in any way to public sector obligations. You see, it's all inside the public sector. So that's that thing. It's a bit of a red herring, really. As far as the other point is concerned. Just remind me what the second question was.
So the second one was, because I proposed like a 75-year Corona bond in order to maintain the number. Simon was suggesting, well, why not just essentially
just consolidate the whole thing?
Just consolidate. And I guess there is a point about, understandably, people concerned about money printing, hyperinflation, and the discipline of markets.
Exactly, that's the fundamental problem. You see, the Bank of England printed money, and as its counterpart, it bought bonds. Which are on its balance sheet. And effectively, it was lending to the government directly. It was creating credit by printing money, lending directly to the government. And that's really not something we want to have in the longer run. I mean, they really need to get rid of this situation and reverse it all. And so, and if we were to do this consolidation, they wouldn't have any power to control money because they wouldn't have anything on their balance sheet that they could buy the money back in with, if you see what I mean. So having printed all this money, at some point, they're going to have to unprint it, given when things get back to kind of normal. That's what we must hope will happen.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts.